Hello, everyone. Good morning to those joining us in the UK. Good afternoon, good evening, perhaps, to those of you joining us from further afield. Welcome to this CARMA webinar, the automotive industry in 2026. My name is Ryan Bolter. I'm a senior business consultant at CARMA, and I'm going to be your host for today's session. The purpose of this panel is to look through a PR and comms lens at the automotive industry in the year ahead, and really pulling on perspectives from those that work in-house, those that work on the agency side of things, those that work in the newsroom, writing the stories, and those that are analysing the media narrative and making sense of it all. And in order to give those perspectives, we've got four panelists joining us today, who I'll hand over now for some quick introductions, starting with Nick Pearson, if I may hand over to you first.
Good morning, everybody. By the looks of the attendee list, there's quite a lot of people that I know who work for Honda, so good morning to you as well. My name's Nick Pearson. I'm the General Manager of Corporate Communications and External Affairs at Honda Motor Europe. So my remit includes our product PR activities across automobile and motorcycle, but also our corporate activities, our engagement with government, and our communications to our 4,000 associates across Europe.
Mike, if I can hand to you for a quick introduction.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Stainton. I'm a director at PFPR Communications. We're a specialist automotive PR consultancy based in the UK, with a client base that spans the world, everything from technology developers through car manufacturers, large and small, startup and established, right through as well into the aftermarket and motor retail. So we have a perspective right across the automotive value chain, and also work both domestically, just in the UK for clients, but also for clients with a global brief as well. So right across the international scene.
Super. Thank you, Mike. Nick Gibbs.
Hello, I'm Nick Gibbs, automotive journalist. I write for the likes of Automotive News Europe and Autocar in the UK, and I focus more on the business side of things.
And finally, Jennifer.
Hello, hi everyone. My name is Jennifer. I'm Director of Insights and Consulting at CARMA West. I am specialised in research programs, and I will share insights and key takeaways that we've seen in media coverage and market research insights projects.
Thank you very much. Well, some house rules. There is a chat function on this webinar, so if you have any comments, any questions, feel free to drop those in, and we will try our very best to turn to those if we have time for a Q&A at the end. For those of you that have seen the description of this webinar, there are some quite chunky topics that we're going to be tackling today, so we'll try and get through those in a timely fashion. The first of those topics, they always say, start these with a softball, something that's quite nice. What better softball than geopolitics as a place to start? Quite a small, minor topic. Jennifer, if I can turn to you first, just set the scene for us from that media analyst perspective, the impact that geopolitics is having, both broader, but also within the automotive industry itself.
Thank you, Ryan. Starting with a very small topic. So on the topic of geopolitics, geoeconomic confrontation is becoming more and more of an issue, not just for automotive brands, but also for any organizations out there pretty much. With these things, I like to look at the data. So if you look at the latest global risks reports that was published by the World Economic Forum a couple of months ago, that's a good source to look at. They track all sorts of risks from economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, technological risks, and so on. And you will find in this report that there are two key takeaways. The first one is that geoeconomic confrontation is top of mind for businesses, leaders, the general public, and was selected as the top risk most likely to trigger a material crisis in 2026. So that's the first thing. The second thing is around uncertainty. Uncertainty is the defining theme for global risks in 2026. And you can really understand why if you look at the multilateral system, it is under incredible pressure. There's declining trust levels, there's less and less transparency as well, there's less respect for the rule of law, there's heightened protectionism, and all these things are really strengthening the way that international relations and trade have been operating for a very long time. And when it comes to trade and investments as well, there's increased propensity for conflict. So from a measurement point of view, we can really feel this. There's more and more of an emphasis on geopolitical topics when we set up projects. Clients will ask us to monitor things like tariffs and regulatory changes and news about investments, but also political statements that are being made or wider geopolitical conflicts. So from a measurement point of view, that means looking at maybe additional topics when we track specific automotive brands, briefs, models and key themes. There will be a more of a focus on this connectivity. And the other thing is around the focus on reactive coverage. So the coverage that these brands not necessarily have so much control over or visibility over, but clients will come to us to say, actually, we want to be more aware of the coverage that is outside our remit. And there's been lots of really interesting geopolitical examples that we've seen in the automotive space recently. We had a president call out the CEO of a very famous British brand, Donald Trump, on Jaguar. When the CEO resigned, he said that he had resigned in disgrace. That was quite a shocking controversy at the time. There's also the topic of Chinese brands on the global stage. We've seen how much of a disruption they've been causing, especially from a Western Europe point of view, but there are some really interesting differences there. If you look at the US, it's all about trade tensions, industrial rivalries. Trump obviously put tariffs. The tariffs are described in media very much as a shield. And these guys are trying to protect the Teslas. They're protecting the big three from Detroit. So industrial rivalry is a key theme. In Europe, there's more of a struggle to try and balance competitiveness, sovereignty. So a lot of brands try and rethink how they communicate the Made in Europe label, especially around security concerns with the Chinese brands. In Asia, if you look at the Chinese brands, for example, China is seen as a manufacturing strength in the region and almost a flashpoint for economic sovereignty concerns as well. And people want to access the innovation, they want to access the innovation, but also there's growing an ease over the technological dependency and the data security and geopolitical leverage there. So you could see how certain themes and stories will resonate really differently based on the different geopolitical agendas in different regions. So all these examples really illustrate why you need to be aware of all of those different dynamics around geoeconomic confrontation and geopolitical economic competitiveness. They're really, really important themes in the automotive industry right now.
Thank you. So, Nick Pearson, we've seen Jennifer there sort of setting the scene, and there's a lot of turbulence going on. And in that turbulence, how do you, as an in-house comms person, how do you even begin to strategize, to plan when there is such uncertainty, unpredictability at the moment?
So I think there's a few things to pick up on there as to how you respond with your communication strategy. I think because there's so much turbulence and so much uncertainty out there, you need to keep your strategy thin and light and understandable. So we need to focus our attention and activity on the points that make us distinctive and stand out. So we cannot cover every base. We need to really hone in on the true key tenets of what our organization is trying to portray out there and build a perception for out in society. I think because of that, you cannot afford as a corporate to be reactive. Certainly in the corporate and government space, in the past, maybe decisions were being made in classic smoke-filled rooms behind closed doors. Now the debate, take the Made in Europe debate, for example, it's ongoing within the Commission at the moment. You need to be a public actor in that narrative, and you need to seize what your message is and be very clear with your message. You cannot afford to wait, or else the conversation will move on without you. And whilst we're seeing this, and Jennifer talked about every region in the world, this massive geopolitical split that we're seeing, it's never been more important as a global corporate to be more connected amongst your global regions, because what we say in one area can have a ripple closer to home. I mean, let's take last week's announcement on the rollback of the endangerment finding in the US. Okay, that is going to have a huge impact on the global industry, and especially a very internationalized player like ourselves. So we need to be aligned and connected between our American business, our Japanese business, our Asian business, our European business, and the rest of the world. And I think finally, we need, as communicators, to shift mindset from that kind of if this, then we do this action, to more of a what if mindset. So I recently attended a talk through AMEC by the academics Addy and Stockler about this idea. And we have to keep, as communicators, constantly imagining new scenarios. What if this happens? What if this change comes to the regulatory landscape or to our product landscape? And I found using AI almost as a sparring partner for that really, really useful to hone and refine our messaging and our strategy.
I'd like to return to that. I think if we have time, I'd like to return to that use of AI question, because I know that's a big one that's always coming up at the moment. But following on from that, Mike, similar question to you. You're obviously working with a whole load of different brands, a whole load of different requirements, different brand guidelines, different messaging. Similar question there. On the agency side of things, like what is almost the playbook for preparedness, I suppose, in the times we're in at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think from what Jennifer and Nick have just said, I'd echo, it's so volatile, it's such an unpredictable world picture that we have with announcements and shocks. As Nick said, they ripple across the global industry. Clients are operating just in the UK, for example, or that we're looking after maybe just in the UK, but others that are global in our remit, and having, to Nick's point, that closeness to each individual key market. So our network in market that are able to interpret the local context of those international impacts of some of these issues is really important. In terms of the playbook, it's it has to be tailored for each individual client. Each individual brand and client have their own strategic perspectives. Many, Nick was saying that you need to be ahead of some of these big, certainly in terms of lobbying, in terms of regulatory aspects, you have to be ahead of the game, and I absolutely endorse that. But many of our clients on some of those wider, more maybe the political rather than the regulatory and economic side, many don't want to put their head above the parapet, because a lot of this stuff is really polarizing. There's a danger of when you have a wide customer base, it can be high risk to take a strong stance one side or the other. So many clients the strategy is to just to keep a watching brief and have a perspective, have a voice if they really feel they have to, but otherwise to keep just to keep a watching brief. Others, though, some of the more some clients are a bit more bold. They need and want to be part of the conversation. They want to provoke a reaction and to take a bold stance. And for them, it's quite this volatility can have present opportunities that they can take advantage of. So yeah, there isn't one playbook. It varies. It requires us to be to plan ahead, but also to be really agile, because some of this stuff does just pop out of the woodwork. It's not something that is always predictable, and that volatility, like I say, it can present opportunities as well as challenges. So each client has we have to tailor our approach and our advice and our counsel for each client separately.
Yeah, and who would have thought we'd be where we are now, 2, 3, 4 years ago? It's that unpredictability, right, in there. And Nick Gibbs, from a journalist perspective, what is it about sort of geopolitical stories within the automotive industry that make them newsworthy or eye-catching? Is it, industrial policy, impact on jobs, consumer pricing? What's your take from a journalist standpoint?
Well, I think everything has a geopolitical element these days, doesn't it? Sort of EVs, AI, autonomous driving, localization. It all has this element that it cannot be ignored as well, because it becomes bigger and bigger. If you're moving jobs to one place to secure your the industry in your particular region, what you're doing is saying, okay, well, we're shutting you guys out, and therefore that becomes a political thing. So it didn't seem to be too radical, but then you're getting into the realms of protectionism. So it all has an element, and also a lot of people are afraid to speak out about it. I think that's the main point that's pertinent to this discussion. And I would implore brands to be a bit bolder about this, because otherwise the conversation just fragments and takes off in regions, in areas, in social media, wherever you can't control. Sort of get the message out there, talk to a more traditional media who you can actually sort of ring up on the other end of the phone, and get them to just talk through what they want, and let's have a little bit more discussion about this.
The follow-up question I was actually going to ask on that, and you've answered it there, really, was, does it help or hinder a brand to be transparent and bolder, to use your words on the it sounds like you're, as from a journalist perspective anyway, in terms of a story, that you want to see that boldness coming through.
Well, of course I want to see that boldness, and I sort of understand why people don't want to be bold, so but and there are consequences. People are very afraid of antagonizing both America and China, because they have shown that they are quite impulsive and also are prepared to punish. And therefore, if some story spirals out of control, there's who knows where it may land, and who knows where the punishment may land. So there's that element to it. But at the same time, you don't want to you don't want to zip your mouth up and pull yourself out of every single discussion. You could be too timid, I think, at the moment.
And that takes me on to, I suppose, an elephant in the room of sorts, when we've mentioned them here, sort of Chinese brands and the increasing presence of those Chinese brands within legacy markets, increasing presence in Europe, and production capabilities, whether that be in Latin America or whether that be in Europe itself. In there, Jennifer, I'll just turn to you at the moment from that media analyst perspective when it comes to Chinese brands, and I guess how they're almost being compared to sort of legacy players, established OEMs in the space. What are the kind of narratives that are coming through before we hand over to the rest of the panel?
Thanks, Ryan. The topic of Chinese brands is really, really fascinating. As the measurement person in the room, I'll say, let's look at the data again. So if you look at the sales data over the past few years, we've seen the Chinese brands obviously really power the global EV markets, because they capture more and more market share, and they really show strong results year on year. And these Chinese brands now account for about 70% of the top 10 positions in the global ranking of EV sellers, which is absolutely huge. So a dominant frame that we see a lot in coverage is around leadership in sales, leadership in innovation, leadership in technology. So when you sell well, that leadership aura, that leadership message will become a lot more prevalent naturally in coverage, almost no matter what you do or say. Now, if you look at opinion surveys, market research data, to understand really what people think and feeling towards these organizations, what are we seeing there? We did a little bit of market research in Europe, Asia, MENA, the US to understand this. So when it comes to choosing a car, people care about safety, price, technology, reliability, and fuel economy in broad buckets. Do these Chinese brands tick all these boxes? Not just yet, but they do tick enough boxes to be able to compete effectively with established car manufacturers all over the world. So that is quite interesting. We also asked people who owned traditional European brands how satisfied they were against Chinese car owners. The European brand owners are proportionally less satisfied with their current car's performance, driving experience and technology aspects. But on the contrary, if you ask the people who own Chinese cars, they seem to be proportionally more satisfied with their car manufacture performance and technology. So that is really, really interesting. And also the technological aspect is very prevalent. So we asked people, do you think your car has some kind of cutting edge technology? 82% of consumers who own a Chinese vehicle say that they believe their car has some kind of cutting edge technology. So that's a really, really strong result. That's a strong narrative, which we are seeing in media coverage as well. 60% of all global reporting that talked about these messages around technology and innovation in relation to Chinese brands were positive. So there's a lot of strong coverage. The coverage is stronger and stronger, in fact. And this push is led by one brand, primarily. It's BYD that is seen as the real standout performer amongst all of those Chinese brands. And they do seem to generate a lot of attention around innovation coverage. However, I have to say, as much as the trust is there, global car owners still believe that Chinese cars are not as reliable. So perhaps that's the box that Chinese manufacturers still need to tick to fully gain that status of the ultimate global disruptor, that reliability box. So that's my take on some of the key themes around Chinese cars.
Just wondering, Nick, with that context, Nick Pearson, how has this sort of changed, I guess, comms priorities for you in-house? Is it a landscape that you've had to adapt to? Have you found that anything's changed at all? I'm sort of almost thinking that Jennifer and I were talking about this beforehand. It doesn't seem too long ago, probably before my time, that the Japanese and South Korean manufacturers are probably being talked about in a similar sense, you know, from the even more traditional players back then. So how has this maybe caused you to adapt or to evolve, Nick Pearson?
I think at the end of the day, let's remember that they are still competing. The Chinese, we're all competing for the attention of the same customers, and the fundamental basis of the product is it's still a car, or in our case, a motorcycle. The product is still offering mobility. Yeah, that's what people are buying, and they're buying that freedom of mobility from us. And I think, not to go toe to toe with Jennifer on research, because I think I'll probably lose, but let's remember in the National Car Buyer Survey that our industry buy into, that undertakes research in a number of key European markets, buy the same. So loyalty is still the biggest purchase reason for buyers. So not everybody wants to switch brands. So I think as a brand in our position, we've got to continue to look after our customers and focus on demonstrating. It goes back to that previous point about being proactive, demonstrating that we deserve the trust that we've earned from them for over many years. So I think that's one piece. I think the other piece is attracting new buyers is obviously harder. The landscape is now, I don't know, it used to be maybe 25 brands. Now it's 50 brands, and there's a new one every week. So again, going back to that point I made in the first pass around, we've got to keep our strategy light and focused. We've got to rely upon what has earned our brand the reputation it has over the last 75 years. So I think the way I'd answer and sign off on that piece is, ultimately, for customers, whether the risk is perception or real of buying a new brand, does everybody want to take that risk? And our position will be that, to posit no. there's still a lot of people who want to engage with familiarity and buy the same. And we're there to look after them and to provide the things that Honda has always provided around trust and quality, and our focus on delivering innovation that works, not just innovation for innovation's sake.
It sounds there the message is almost stick to your principles, really. You know, the principles that have got you to this point. It's not a case of, it's almost that being proactive, not being reactive ultimately in there. And similar thing, Mike, on your side, again, whether you're advising a Chinese entrant, whether you're advising perhaps a legacy brand in that part, what's your take when it comes to this? Are you on sort of Nick Pearson's side here of, you know, stick to those core principles? Where do you stand on this issue?
Yeah, I think most of the Chinese brands are pretty new to the market, and they're the one key factor that, to Jennifer and Nick's point, that they haven't yet earned, because it's hard earned, is just trust. Most of the brands are new. Most of the brands are certainly new to Europe and the UK, for example. Many of them are very, very young, even in their own domestic markets. And trust is something that obviously, you know, we always used to say trust is hard earned. But having said that, Nick's point about, you know, do people want to take the risk? And I mean, the sales figures suggest that there's a pretty large proportion of the motoring public in the UK, for example, and across Europe, that are prepared to take that risk and to try a new brand. So that sort of brand loyalty, I think, is there's probably a strong core, but there's also a large proportion of media of the buying public that are prepared to take that risk, and a lot of that comes through you know, the narratives that those Chinese brands, for example, are building in the market, and through their media activities and the way that they launch, the way that they communicate. They know they don't necessarily have that trust built up over time, but they're, for example, communicating about long warranties. They're communicating about their parts availabilities, addressing often weaknesses that aren't that far in the rearview mirror. It wasn't that long ago, and I think Tesla also was blighted by this, that there's quite a reputation that these new EV brands come to the market and then don't have the backup. They don't have the after sales backup. They don't have the parts, for example. That's one issue. So new brands coming right now and very recently have been focused on addressing that particular issue, about, you know, you can rely on us. We've got the parts. We've got long warranties. We'll look after you. So they're trying to face head on those perceived weaknesses that they've had. So yeah, and again, every brand, they're all fighting. There's so much competition, and most of the new brands are operating in a fairly similar position in the market. So finding a point of differentiation, finding their own position that they can claim for themselves in the market is quite a challenge. So you know, focusing on their own particular strengths, their own particular brand position that they've brought maybe from their domestic markets. Often that's technology, and just banging that drum repeatedly to try to claim that position. I think on the narratives that they're trying to dispel, the myths they're trying to bust is around quality and reliability. Jennifer was saying reliability is something that Chinese brands seem to struggle with still in terms of perception. I remember we've been working with Chinese brands for one of the very first that came to Europe maybe 15 years ago, and the overriding message they were trying to push was quality, and that was off the back of a few previous attempts for Chinese brands to come where they were assessed by Euro NCAP, for example, as absolutely disastrous. So they were very much pushing the quality of their engineering and of their manufacturing. And I think broadly speaking, these days the narratives they're trying to push, they're almost taking them for granted, and the narratives they're now trying to push is more around that technology, a bit more about the lifestyles that are enabled by them, and the way their products are set up. So it's more, it's maturing and it's evolving very quickly as the market is becoming more accepting of them. They're now trying to find that more mature message to push.
Super, thank you. And Nick Gibbs, newsroom perspective here, Chinese brands. What's catching the eye? I know you maybe predominantly write more on the trade side of things rather than the consumer side of things, perhaps. But where do you stand on this? What's kind of catching the eye from a story perspective, and how you're being asked to talk about this situation?
Well, I mean, it's an amazing story, isn't it? I mean, you've got to keep one eye on the consumer side because that's driving what's happening on the business side as well. And it's interesting what the perception of technology leadership. It's mainly come from the ability to drive down the price of EVs. Because if you look at the technology in the EVs, it's all right. I mean, but generally they charge slower, and these are the value ones. They charge slower. The range isn't as good. They have the PHEVs. They have a certain amount of issues when it comes to fuel consumption on the ICE side of it, combustion engine side. So they have a lot more technology because the price, and it's affordable because the customer can see that they get a bigger car with more tech versus the competition. So that's why they've taken off, and also they've had a sort of once in a generation ability to come in and take over dealers from legacy brands that were. For whatever reason, after the COVID crisis, they were trying to focus more on value over volume, and that leaves the dealers with very little to sell. So in come the Chinese and say, okay, we'll snap up your dealers and establish ourselves in a way that they wouldn't have been able to do perhaps if COVID hadn't come along and sort of thrown all the balls in the air. And what they've done now, I speak to the ones that have come through first, like BYD and the Cherry brands. They're now going to have to, and MG, of course, they're going to have to consolidate, but they're now in a very good position to do that because they're here. People know them, they can see the dealers, and the mistakes that they'll make, on parts or whatever, then they can rectify pretty easy by sort of like refining the process.
I'm going to stick with you, Nick, as we move to a sort of related topic in terms of picking up sort of technological leadership almost, and the topic of ADAS, autonomous driving. The reason we wanted to include this in this section is that we've seen it as an increasingly talked about topic. For example, we were looking at CES that took place in Vegas in January, and within the automotive and mobility space, it was one of the key topics that came through. NVIDIA with its AI-powered self-driving platform, closed-door meetings with Jensen Huang and Hyundai's chairman, for example, and what that all sparked in terms of potential partnerships. Autonomous driving, ADAS. I know that we've spoken before this webinar on this topic, and there's been some really interesting views on this. Again, newsroom perspective, when we talk about technology, particularly autonomous driving, ADAS in here, are we sort of running into a risk of this becoming quite sort of ambiguous terminology of what is autonomous driving, what's ADAS, and what's ultimately going to turn opinion on this matter?
Yeah, I mean, this is from an automotive news perspective. We come to this on two angles. One's at the consumer side, and what do the everyday consumers want out of these systems in their car, and then we come from the business side, because as far as the car companies are concerned, ADAS and sort of moving on closer towards autonomy is a technology story that they still have. They can still grab. They don't. The Chinese have their own autonomous story, but for the moment, they're not being able to break through into Europe and the US in the same way. So this is the car companies are going to push this, and we're going to see that this year, even as they back away from other innovations that they've been pushing. But on the consumer side, obviously, you've got older car buyers, that drive the majority of the new car market, being foisted these systems that are base level because they're done to satisfy the regulations rather than sort of improve the consumer's enjoyment of the car. So you've got this clash. You've got on one hand, on the business side of it, you've the finance departments, the R&D department saying this is going to improve your life. This is the investor story. It's going to grow our margins, and then on the other side, the consumers are saying, no thanks, we don't want any of this because it forces my car into the middle of the road, etc., etc. So there's a fundamental difference there in the the message on one side and the implementation on the other. I think we're going to see that coming closer together in this year and in the medium term, but it's going to be interesting. And I'm obviously from news side, I can cover that, which is I like.
And thank you, Nick. I'll turn Nick Pearce, if I can turn to you with that kind of what's that balancing of the two things there that Nick Gibbs talked about from your side, whether it's ADAS and talking about capabilities, whether it's even a conversation around full autonomous driving. What's your view? Where do you stand on this?
I think there's, as Nick said, there's two strands to this. There's the corporate level where OEMs, including ourselves, are making promises and strategic announcements. We're making investments, we're making partnerships and developing new technology. And I think it's going to be an area where we're seeing a fight for supremacy amongst all those different manufacturers, because as Nick says, this is still up for grabs as to who's the undisputed leader in this area. I think if we switch back to the customer, going back to my previous point, is it still has to work in simple terms for them and actually deliver a value that the customer wants. So a bit like electrification, ADAS, the transition to ADAS or self-drive or whatever we call it, it has to survive its encounter with reality. And if the reality is uncomfortable or difficult for the customer, they're going to disengage. You're always going to have those who are at the leading edge of this, who want the latest stuff and will perhaps put up with a bit of a few issues, but for the general public, for the let's call it the middle driver or rider, I think it's really got to be intuitive and user friendly. And I think the ultimate test of this technology for us certainly will be fitting these types of systems to motorcycles, because your average motorcycle rider is very discerning about what goes on his or her motorcycle, given the risk level. The risk level is amplified for a motorcycle rider. Will they buy into this technology? And it really has to work and be intuitive for that type of customer. So I think there is those two strands, but fundamentally, you can throw as much technology as you want at it. It has to be technology and innovation that works.
Mike, technology and innovation that has to work. Anything you would add in that regard, and I guess your experience of working with clients and this issue of this topic, should I say, of ADAS and even autonomous driving, your experiences there?
Yeah, I mean, it's just turning back to the media specifically and how many of our clients, brands communicate to those end audiences that Nick are both referenced, the consumer. Often it's through the lens, it's through the media, through the press, through content creators that we have to communicate. And I think we have to, as an agency, when we're advising our clients, we have to bear in mind not just the consumer perspective, but the media as well. And many are very forthright and straightforward in their frustrations with this technology. And I think with all manner of technology, but in particular recently ADAS, touchscreens for even the most fundamental safety-related controls, there's a bit of a disdain for it. And part of that, I think, especially when we come to sort of the perhaps those that are not quite yet deployed, the autonomous tech and the more advanced ADAS, part of that is that we've been promised for significant advancements and deployments and readiness for market for a long time with a lot of this technology, a lot of this more advanced technology, and it hasn't necessarily been realized. And then there comes this a jaded perspective on it. It becomes frustratingly slow to come when they've been fed stories for many, many years by some of those claiming to be pioneers at the forefront of the tech development.
It's all right. We in the
And it's
media
not coming.
we stopped listening to Elon.
Yeah, well, there you go, right? And so that almost is my point. And if the media that are our conduit for reaching those end consumers in many cases, if they are starting to either switch off or to just present quite a cynical, skeptical view of it, then what the end customer is seeing is that reticence and that skepticism, and that really has an impact on their own views, because they can't experience the tech and they're just there because it's not out yet. So they're very much receptive to what the trusted voices that they read or listen to or watch, what their view is. And it's, as you just pointed out, Nick, you're skeptical about it. And so that's a real challenge, because as and when those technologies are ready, apparently ready, then we have to appeal to you to listen again. But that comes after a long period of eroding that trust, eroding the faith in that message. So that presents a real problem for us as communicators, working through and with the media to get to the end customer, to believe in the tech and the advantages, the benefits it brings to everyday driving. And that's a real that can be tough.
Thank you, Mike. And we've got a few minutes left now. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I'm going to take an executive decision that we plow on forward to the 45 minutes at this point. And Jennifer, I'm going to hand to you, and this will be, if we have time for the rest of the panel, 60-second thoughts on, again, what is admittedly a big topic as well. But it's on that message there you said there, Mike, about sort of connecting with the media and getting the message out there, and what sort of the media landscape looks like now with a lot of kind of media fragmentation. There are a number of different ways that you can communicate. So Jennifer, if I can turn to you just for some thoughts there on how that earned media landscape has changed and in the last 12 months, and how it maybe is looking to change going forward in 60 seconds, if you may.
Thank you. It's changed a lot. That's the headline. I'm going to get the obvious one out of the way first. Geo and generative AI searches are changing the way that people consume news and information. So the information is being surfaced completely differently now. People interact with LLMs, with ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, Gemini, Perplexity, and so on to inform themselves. And the usage of these tools for news consumption purposes is really, really increasing rapidly. And so there's a bit of an AI consumption revolution, which we are witnessing. And there's been various different studies that have been done on the topic that show that around 80 to 90% of citations come from earned media sources. So a lot of people say that it's the golden age of PR again. PR is back. Why is that? Because the strategic placements of your brand and your models in the right top target outlets that are read by the LLMs is going to shape the perception of your brand on these sources. So talking about fragmentation, but right at the heart of it, I think social media is an interesting one as well. We might be reaching a bit of a tipping point because platforms have been increasingly flooding our feeds with AI generated content, in other words, AI slop. And you might see exactly what I'm talking about, this very weird, ultra processed content that floods our feeds. And so with that, I think we might see perhaps audiences become a little bit more divided over time. On the one hand, you might have users who will keep consuming this type of very bizarre content, but on the other, you might have people who are turning away from social platforms because of the very desperate methods to try and grab eyeballs. So people may spend a little bit less time on social platforms, but we're also seeing lots of media consumption reports that show us that more and more people use social platforms to inform themselves. So you're going to have a really nuanced strategy there to perhaps tailor the message, but also have more face-to-face authentic interactions with your customers and interact where they spend more time going forward. And the last one will be also when there's polarization, but we're running out of time. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
And with that as well, we have actually received a question in the Q&A. So I feel like I might throw this one very quickly for very quick answers to the panel at this point. This question's come in terms of, what do you think about marketing strategies related to EVs? Is it very easy to create confusion in potential customers? And they provided the example here of the A4 being electric, the A5 being petrol powered, but really kind of being the A4 in there as one example there. So quick fire round to the panel. Nick Pearson, thoughts, feelings, EV strategies, confusion. Where do you stand?
It's very important to label the product so that the customer understands what they're buying. End of message.
Love that. Mike Stainton, how about you?
Yeah, I can't argue with that. It's about clarity in communications. So across the marketing mix, across from PR, but through social, through Otherline, it's got to be pulled together. It's got to be consistent. It's all got to pull in the same direction. And we've got to present to the customer what the advantages of that, in this case EVs. What are the advantages over other technologies that that customer may be considering? But it's got to be clear and consistent and simplified. There's a real danger, EVs in particular, but as we talked about other technologies, of using jargon and acronyms, and we've got to remember that most motoring, most motorists, most car buyers, they're not deep into the industry and the jargon like those of us that work in this space are, and we've got to simplify the messages so they can be they're digestible.
Thank you. And Nick Gibbs, final remarks from you. Clarity is key. I assume yes is the answer in this regard.
Well, I am into the jargon, so I can kind of understand what's going on, and yeah, it's quite hard to see the point of view from the consumer. I don't necessarily have to do that in the part of the business that I'm in, but I think with EVs, especially if you look at the top end, you always wonder why the one at the top end, with the highest price and all the bells and whistles, why that's got the smallest range, because it's got 4-wheel drive, because it's got this, it's like it's a small thing, but it just illustrates within the world of EVs, the ICE. It's that you can't just cut and paste ICE onto EVs. They're a different beast.
Super. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to those that have attended. This brings us to the close. If we're going to stick loosely within our time limits at this point, and conscious of our panelist time as well. So thank you to our panelists, Nick Pearson, Nick Gibbs, Jennifer Sanchez, and Mike Stainton. Thank you again for those of you that have joined us today. We hope to run another one of these in the not too distant future. And if you want to follow up at all, please feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with myself and Jennifer. We'll be happy to answer any further questions that you may have. And thank you once again. Take care now.